Episode 2 ended with a hidden question. If precision is fear, who is pretending otherwise? Somewhere behind the technique, behind the polish, behind the performance, there is a self doing it all. And we rarely turn around to look at it. Before we ever pick up the instrument, someone is already holding it. This episode asks who that is, what that self is made of, where it came from, and what happens when something more real begins to surface beneath it. And what if it turns out the instrument is playing us? Hold that thought. As in the previous episodes, we move between two streams. One that examines the external machinery of performance culture, and the other that follows inner transformation. In this episode, the streams converge more tightly than before, because both concern the same thing: the self we were handed, and what happens when it begins to burn. We begin with how that self is built. In the first two episodes, I described what Byung-Chul Han calls the achievement subject. That's in Psychopolitics, 2017. The self that must constantly perform and prove its value. So the self that polices itself without any external master. That self subjugates. Now I want to recast that in production terms, because that is what it is. The career musician is a manufactured unit, manufactured to specs. The values of this production line are the values of every production line: speed, volume, quantity, efficiency, uniformity, and above all, popularity. These are industrial values, not musical ones. They were never derived from music. They were imposed on it. The same way they were imposed on every other craft the system absorbed. And like any production line, every unit that rolls off it reduces the value of the next. It is textbook inflation. The more players who can execute the same passages at the same speed with the same polish, the less any single one of them is worth to the market that trained them. They all become replaceable, interchangeable, just like our unit of exchange, the dollar. The musician is played by the market and played by the oversupply of their own peers, selling themselves to an audience that is overstimulated, overworked, desensitized, culturally conditioned, economically strained, and exhausted by too many options. An audience whose capacity for desire has already been spent. The unit is manufactured for a market that can no longer want it. That is not a malfunction. That is the market working as intended. The mechanism underneath all of this was described by Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to turn them into objects. And that explains the whole factory. An object does not inquire. An object does not ask whether the values it embodies are its own. And objects are what gets disposed of. There is the word in the title. The disposable self is not a provocation. It is a technical description of what the production line manufactures. a self built by removing the capacity for inquiry, which is a hallmark of consciousness. Installed early, before we are old enough to refuse it. We learn what music is for, what skill is for, what an audience is for, long before we are capable of asking whether any of it is true. This is not a hidden process. Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, admitted as much in 1928 in a book bluntly titled Propaganda. We are governed and our tastes are formed largely by people we have never heard of. He was not warning us, he was selling the service. And now in 2026, the same machinery that manufactured the career musician unit is manufacturing its replacement. AI-generated music is not an anomaly of the system, and it is not an invasion from outside it. It is the system completing its own logic. If the musician was only ever a unit of output, a bundle of speed, polish, and popularity metrics, then a machine that produces the same outputs more cheaply is not a corruption of the model. It is the model, perfected. The disposability was always the point. The technology has only made it visible. But I want to be careful because it would be easy to spend the whole episode pointing fingers at the industry, the market, the machine, and that is not where this goes. The production line is not only outside us, but inside the self we were handed before we could refuse it. That is where the episode turns inward and stays. I want to describe the three figures. What I mean by the three figures. Three fates inside the machine. You may recognize them yourself. The first is the unheard one. This player never risked exposure. The work stayed private year after year, not as discipline, but as avoidance. There was always a reason. Not ready yet. Not good enough yet. The conditions not right yet. From the outside, this can even look like integrity, a refusal to feed the machine. But the fire we are going to talk about requires contact. It requires the self to be put somewhere it can be seen and fail and be misunderstood. Because that contact never came, the fire never rose. This self was preserved intact, preserved and never born. So the second is the armored one. This player is heard everywhere, but only through the mask. The polished execution, the staged feeling, the sanitized signal, running the whole gauntlet. Everything arrives except the player. This is the middle figure, and it is the heart of the three, for two reasons. First, because armor is where most live. The armored one is not a cautionary tale about someone else. It is the room most are sitting in. Second, because this figure alone still stands at a threshold with a live choice. The unheard one has not yet reached the threshold. The third figure, as we will see, was carried past it. Only the armored one stands before the mirror, with the decision still open. There is a historical embodiment of that choice. Glenn Gould, one of the great virtuosos of the 20th century, walked off the concert stage at 31, at the height of his fame. and never returned. He saw the competitive performance culture of his time clearly and named it. He named what it does to its participants. It leaves them, in his words, victims of a spiritual lobotomy. Gould faced the mirror. He let the concert artist, the unit the system had built and rewarded, break apart. And he spent the rest of his life treating the studio not as a stage, but as a vessel, a place where the work could happen without the audience's eyes on the body. We will return to that word vessel, so keep it in mind. The third is the broken one. This player met the fire without a container. The disillusion was real. The mask really did burn, but there was nothing to hold the process. No practice, no frame, no understanding of what was happening or why. And so the fracture became the whole story. The breaking that could have been a beginning was experienced only as an ending. Some stopped playing entirely. Some remain hollowed, going through motions that no longer even pretend to mean anything. And some self-destruct entirely. The lesson of the three figures is this: the blackening is not the tragedy. Avoiding it is one tragedy. Entering it unheld is another. And this is why the episode cannot end in analysis. It has to end in practice. Because the container is the practice. We are working towards it now. The alchemist had a name for what I have been circling. Sol Niger, the black sun, a dark light that burns before it illuminates. The image sits at the center of the Negrito phase in Alchemy, the blackening we encountered at the end of episode 2. And it's worth replaying that or watching it if you haven't seen it yet. Best to start with episode 1, though. Those are the cornerstones, episode 1 and 2. So Negrito describes something the ordinary language of self-improvement cannot. The light that does not comfort. A sun that rises inside the psyche and begins, without permission, to burn. The black sun does not announce itself. It first appears as heat, internal stress and pressure, irritability without object. The sense that something somewhere underneath the daily self is breaking through. The self begins to cook. Under enough tension, it starts to fracture. And what is burning is precisely the manufactured unit. The self that has been living on validation and performance. The self assembled on the production line we described. The fire is not attacking you, it is consuming what was never you to begin with. And let no one sanctify the factory for this. The system did not build the mask so that you could burn it. And it will pay you handsomely right to the end to keep it on. Two things need to be said about this process, and neither is comfortable. The first is that it cannot be reversed. There's no stopping it. Once something in us has genuinely seen through the mask, that seeing cannot be unseen. The second is that it cannot be fully escaped. It can only be resisted And the resistance works for a while at a cost, and the cost rises exponentially. Every resistance requires more energy, more polish, more noise to hold the old form together against a heat that does not go away. There is a simple way to locate this place in the body, and every player already knows it. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. The black mirror behind the eyelids, not the black mirror in your pocket, the original, the one you owned before any device, the one you have looked at your whole life without ever seeing. That is the gateway. Musicians close their eyes constantly. At the peak of a phrase, in the moment of deepest concentration, and we have always half known why. It is where the performance stops and something else becomes possible. The black sun rises from that mirror. We only have to stop looking and start seeing. But that takes something present behind the eyes, beyond the manufactured unit. Once the fire is lit, only two real responses remain. The first is to double down on the mask. Strengthen it, polish it, make it more convincing, more impressive, harder to see through. This is a defensive move, and it is important to understand why it never fully works. The mask has already been seen through internally. Whatever the audience believes, the one wearing it knows. And so the performance splits in two, an outer performance for the world and an inner performance for oneself, an increasingly expensive effort not to know what is already known. The cost is energy, and it keeps rising. The cost is self-respect, and that rises even faster. The subtlest form of doubling down deserves its own name, and I would call it the maskless mask, performing the removal of the mask, authenticity as the new act, vulnerability as the new repertoire, rawness as the new polish, the confession that is really a costume. The system is endlessly adaptable on this point. The moment honesty acquires market value, the production line begins manufacturing honesty. If you have begun to see through your own performance, the first thing the old self will offer you is a performance of having seen through it. It is the mask one layer deeper. This is still the first response. The other escape is multiplication. So multiplying the mask. Collect masks. Become fluent in all of them. Call the fluency compassion. But a wardrobe of masks is still a wardrobe. And skill in disguise is not the same as having a face. Some masks are real. They are the ones we never had to put on and never have to insist we are not wearing. There is also the copeless cope, the one who apologizes for the system in order to maintain the disposable self. Violence on top of violence, as if the system, or worse, the grand design, only has our best interest in mind. Perhaps it is their bank account or their institutional role in the machine, or simply their own investment in their self-worth dependent on it. But no structural critique goes undefeated, and no tension left unresolved. Which is the main point. The copeless cope has nothing to do with the system, and everything to do with restoring their own comfort, which derails Negrito. Now back to the first response. You can hear it. Sanitized sound is the audio equivalent of the mask, the scrubbed noise floor, the denoised human, the breath and the fingers and the room edited away. Every recording smoothed to the same sterile surface. We have built tools that can remove every trace of a body from a performance. And we use them reflexively because the body is where the exposure is. But as the heat increases, something strange happens. The old rewards begin to lose their charge. Technical mastery, speed, staged emotion, the whole currency of the system starts to feel like play acting. And worse, it starts to sound like play acting, even to the one producing it. Sanitized sound becomes audible as sanitized. And letting the raw bleed through, the noise, the breath, the buzzes and creaks, the evidence of an actual human in a room begin to feel more honest than continuing the performance. The second response is to face the mirror and let the old form break. This is more destabilizing at first. There is no way to soften that. The first response offers continuity, familiarity, the momentum of a self that knows how to operate. The second offers none of that. But it is the only path that does not eventually collapse under its own weight, because it is the only one not built on an ongoing expenditure against the truth. What does the second path actually feel like from inside? This deserves care because the culture has no honest vocabulary for it. It will be called burnout, crisis, losing your edge, and every one of those names smuggles in the assumption that the correct response is repair, restoration, getting back to how it was. That assumption is exactly wrong. As the cooking continues, the everyday self begins to crack and wear away. The strategies stop deploying automatically. The reflexive reach for speed, for polish, for the impressive gesture misfires, or completes and feels faked. And the world the old self was built for starts to withdraw as well. The self and the spectacle reject each other. Gradually and then mutually, until what remains is something like a figment, surrounded on all sides by a world unknown. Uncertainty, emptiness, mystery. Not the decorative mystery of an album title, but the real thing. Genuinely not knowing who is playing the instrument, or why, or for whom. The eggshell cracks, the raw bleeding through the polished surface, the need to control dissolving, the dark light that burns before it illuminates. I want to be precise about what dies here, because the fear of this stage is mostly for the wrong thing. The musician does not die. The love that first brought us to the instrument, before the system got its hands on us, does not die. In fact, it is usually the only thing left standing. What dies is the performer who needed constant fuel. The self that could not touch the instrument without an audience, real or imagined, watching the transaction. Its death feels like the end of everything only because it had convinced us it was everything. It wasn't. It was the packaging. And here the title gives up its second meaning. The culture treats us as disposable, and it is right about the self it handed us. The system built that self, so the system can replace that self. Neither fact touches what we actually are. Only the manufactured can burn. Here is the container I promised when we spoke of the third figure. This is not a technique for moving past the blackening. I'm going to repeat that because everything in us will want to hear it otherwise. This is not a way out. Rushing to resolve the negrito is just the first response, wearing a spiritual costume. This is a practice for staying inside it, without reaching for the old strategies. The practice is slow, exposed, plain. Take material you know, or a single phrase, or even a single interval, and play it in free time. No tempo at all. Below comfort. With no pulse there is no momentum to carry you, and nowhere to hide. No speed to hide in. No density to armor with. Every note audible and alone, and fully responsible for itself. Let each note decay completely before the next begins, so that you are playing into silence and receiving each note back out of it. Eyes closed, because the black mirror is already there. Lean into it. Listen to it. What you will notice first is discomfort. And the discomfort is diagnostic. Every impulse that arises to add a note, to push the tempo, to shape the phrase into something presentable, is the old self reaching for its tools. You do not have to fight these impulses. You only have to see them and not obey, and stay. The exposure you feel is not a flaw in the practice. The exposure is the practice. There is an inversion at the center of this that I find remarkable. Consider what the performance culture demands of an ideal audience. To be silent, to be still, to be unproductive, to be attentive, to be receptive. Now notice that this is everything the same culture forbids its performers, who must be audible, active, productive, and displayed at all times. The two roles were split apart and assigned to different bodies. This practice reunites them. It is the player finally joining the audience of their own sound, receiving it rather than presenting it. And this is not a retreat from communication. Stillness and receptivity are not the absence of communication. They are its precondition. Nothing can be transmitted through a channel that is already full of self. In episode 1, I named the 4 magical virtues: to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent. The 4th returns here, and in this stage of the work, it carries more weight than the others. Really, the other 3 combined. Silence is not always absence. There is a knowing that arrives in silence, before the word, and it does not survive premature speech. Talk about the process too early, package it, explain it, perform it, and you will feel something go out of it. The way the tension goes out of a string when it slips its peg. Some things do their work only in the dark, and Negrito is the dark in which they work. But there is a second sense of silence I want to name, a harder one. While the mask is still on, and for many it will be on for a long time, silence can be the only form of integrity available. You may not yet be able to play from the real, let alone be real. The old habits are deep. The fear is real. The fingers reach for the armor on their own. Maybe not even aware of that armor. What you can do, even then, is refuse to keep testifying for the false. You can stop advocating for the values you have seen through. You can decline to perform enthusiasm for the metrics, the rankings, the whole apparatus of manufactured worth, even while you are still partly caught in it. That refusal makes no sound. No one will applaud it, and that is precisely why it can be trusted. Silence, in this sense, is not passivity. It is a way of not actively working against what has been recognized, not fragmenting. A fidelity held below the threshold of display. So one more image belongs to this stage, at its far edge. In the alchemical sequence, the blackening is followed by a whitening, the albedo. Its symbol is the full moon after the new moon. A cool, reflected light that begins to purify perception. It is borrowed light, not yet the sun, not yet a self that generates its own warmth, but has one property worth knowing about in advance. Truth that has been genuinely heard behaves like this light. Once it has entered, it continues working whether the everyday self cooperates or not. You do not have to believe in the process. The moon does not require the sea's consent to shine on it. That's all I'm going to say on the whitening for now, but more to come. So what is on the other side of Negrito? Not immediately, not without process, but in the direction this whole work is pointed. The deeper movement is a gradual flushing of the achievement subject, the manufactured unit, from the system of the self. What begins to take root in its place is a different kind of value, an inner wellspring that owes the system nothing, that does not rise and fall with the metrics, that does not need the next performance to prove better than the last. Gould, again, gives us the words for what this is and what it's for. The purpose of art, he said, is not a momentary jolt of adrenaline, but the lifelong construction of a state of wonder and serenity. Notice that nothing in that sentence can be measured, ranked, or sold. That is not a weakness of the definition. That is the definition. And from this ground, the counterfeit can finally be named for what it is. The artist we see and hear in the market is not an artist. It is the artist's disposable replacement, a mechanical reproduction of an original that was never consulted, an image referencing no reality, only the system's mirror facing itself. But what the postmodern philosopher Baudrillard called a simulacrum, a copy without an original. So the market does not dispose of artists. It never contained any to begin with. It circulates their replacements. It simulates what cannot be purchased. Because a genuine creative act is an act of spirit, and no market can reproduce it. The market reproduces final forms. The act itself was never for sale. I wrote about this room years ago. In 2023, in a poem called The Music Box. Watching the production line run, the mechanics with their swinging metronomes and their chain link arpeggios. The line I will leave you with is this: the artist cannot be produced, or reproduced, or reduced to a servant of economic warfare. The artist was never on the line. The black sun does not ask permission. Once it has risen, the old self has only two responses: double down on the mask at greater and greater cost, or let the disposable self burn so that something real can begin to come through the instrument. What is left when the burning has done its work is not a better performer. Before a vessel can receive anything, it must first be emptied. And emptying it is its own work. That is where we go next, which returns us to the opening thought. When the disposable self is gone, who is left to play? That only time will tell, and the artist within, if there is one. If this resonated with you, feel free to subscribe for more episodes, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening.